Today we talk with a well-established India hand, Iwanek, about the claims and clashes in the mountains, about the maritime claims, and also the exercise in Russia. Welcome to the show. Welcome to the third part. Here I would like to discuss the recent military exercises that India was involved in, and they caused some controversy, and then later talk about the Indian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Jaishankar. He's a very, very interesting gentleman. So let's start with those recent exercises.
Yeah. So what you are referring to give the audience a bit of an introduction is that Russia is hosting its regular military drills in eastern Siberia, as well as in the Okhotsk Sea and Japan Sea. These are the Vostok 2022 exercises, if I'm not wrong, to which Russia, as it usually does, invited the more friendly countries it has, the few friendly countries that Russia actually has, among which there are two largest Asian states, China and India. Indeed, India accepted the invitation, as they did in the past. Indeed, as we are speaking, Indian soldiers are there training along the Chinese ones and the Russian ones. Now, to be sure, while this has created ripples and waves and controversies, the controversy in the West is different than the controversy in India, if you can speak about the controversy in India as such. So the West is unhappy with India holding exercises with Russia. But in India, those who are unhappy with the fact that India is holding exercises with China. For them, holding exercises with Russia is not an issue. They had always had them. So having said this, a very general remark for me to make is that India is trying and still is neutral in that web of international relations which we now have across the globe. By neutral, I specifically mean that India's goal is not to formally ally itself with one power. By global powers, I mean three: US, China, and Russia. Among these, India would not ally itself with China anyway, because China is a rival, or maybe even, simply speaking, an enemy of India. So that's out of the question at the very beginning. So that leaves India with would leave India with two options rather than being neutral: being an ally of the West, mainly the US, or being an ally of Russia. So India does not want both. They want to squeeze out what is best of the relation with the West, and the same goes for Russia, without becoming a formal ally of neither. Whether this will be possible in the long run, we'll see. But New Delhi believes it is possible, and so far they have been proven right, because there were so many criticism of India's position towards the war in Ukraine. To be more specific, many diplomats and experts from the West have been pressurizing India to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which India never did. And their position still hasn't changed. I mean, maybe time will pass and something will change. Maybe the US will sanction India. They could, but they did not. I mean, half a year has passed since the beginning of that terrible war, and the US has done nothing to hurt India for India's standpoint on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I think the Indians are playing this game that way. Let's try to look at this from their perspective and American perspective. From the Indian perspective, Russia is not a threat. Russia is not a challenge. That's a completely different perspective than we have. You know, Russia doesn't have any territorial dispute. They don't even share a border with India. Russians, don't assassinate people on Indian streets like they do in Europe. Uh, and Russia has always, been friendly towards India to a point where Russians are currently building nuclear reactors in India. Russians are still the top source of Indian military technologies.
Yes.
So all of that is this is good for India. Now, Indians are aware that the West is unhappy about this. But now, for the US, it would be good to undermine the relations between India and Russia. However, the US must take into account another power, which is China. So the US, I think, understands well that they cannot have India on their side against Russia, but they should have India on their side against China. So so the US is kind of forced to turn, a blind eye on the Indo-Russian cooperation, so that India would cooperate with the US against China. And India knows it as well. The whole thing, for example, one instance is when Indians purchased the S-400, air defense system, where the US was clearly pressure from Russia, where the US was clearly pressurizing India not to purchase it. And President Trump, the CATSA legal act came into force in the US, which where Washington gave itself uh, legal means to sanction India. But they have not. President Trump, when asked about this, said India will find out soon enough how they will be punished for buying that system. Uh, and then he did nothing about this. President Biden came to power. Again, there was gossip that US will sanction India, and again, nothing happened. So for now, India has been playing this card well. They know that the US needs them against China. Actually, one high-ranking American naval officer has said this openly. We cannot allow ourselves to sanction those partners in Asia, like Vietnam and India, which we may need against China. So we have to accept the fact that they cooperate with Russia. Uh, so that brings us back to those military exercises. So that simply, from the Indian perspective, is because India is, playing many pianos at the same time, or is fence sitting, to use a more elegant metaphor. Um, Now, India is doing this mainly to keep a good to keep its perception of India being a neutral country, neutral in the sense of being between the West and Russia and cooperating with both. So they are accepting such invitations to military exercises, invitations sent by Russia, because they want to be on good terms with Russia. Now they don't really want, possibly, I don't think they really want to train with China. They just have to accept this, because one thing which India really doesn't like about Russian foreign policy is the fact that Russians are growingly on good terms with China. And believe me, Indian experts see this. I have read many commentaries, where Indian experts are aware of that. It's not that they don't see this, that there is a growing Sino-Russian cooperation. They are just hoping that they can have what is best of the relation with Russia, without the Sino-Russian cooperation becoming a threat to India. So I think it works like this. Uh, Russia sends an invitation. India says, okay, we should go for a military drill with Russia because we want to keep that security cooperation with Russia
Yes.
open. But Russia also invites China, and the Indians are, all right, well, what can we do? I mean, they are the host, right? But it must be stressed that India and China have also uh, been having bilateral military exercises up to 2020, when the border skirmish happened in Ladakh in June 2020. These have been discontinued. So it's clear that New Delhi doesn't want to have military exercises with China to show how angry they are about what happened in 2020. So I assume that given a chance, New Delhi would not want any type of military exercise with China to show their political position. However, that's bilateral. Bilateral relations are the ones which they can affect more. When it comes to multilateral relations, like exercises held by Russia or cooperation within the South China, SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I meant these are multilateral where China is also a stakeholder, so India is kind of willy nilly cooperating with China within such frameworks. Although I don't think that was their objective. Their objective was to be neutral and to primarily to be on good terms with Russia. By the way, I know this is puzzling that they are training with China while having a dispute with China, and I believe that it's also politically inconvenient in India internally. If you remember the Olympics in Beijing this year, uh, India has sent its sportsmen, and an Indian diplomat, a consul, was supposed to be present at the first day of the Olympics in China this year. But then it turned out that one of the persons on the Chinese side to take part in the opening ceremony was a Chinese soldier who was fighting the Indian soldiers back in 2020, who is seen as a mortal enemy in India and as a hero in China. Now, when Indians found out, they withdrew any diplomatic representation they would have at the opening ceremony of the Olympics. So there are internal political challenges for India here at the end of the day. While fighting with the Chinese in the Himalayas, their government cannot be seen as holding a political debate with China on a certain level. They must show that they are angry, right, and that they are bold against China. So I'm not sure if platforms such as holding military exercises with both Russia and China by India will hold. I mean, if things go south, if the Sino-Indian border dispute becomes even more tense, which is always an option, you know within India, questions will be raised. Why are we still holding exercises with the Chinese, right? So I think that whole Indian membership in SCO and the thing of those multilateral exercises India is holding with Russians and Chinese are a liability, are a certain political challenge for India, and maybe in case there are worse tensions, maybe India will withdraw. I mean, they can be a member of SCO, but say we will not join any exercises that would be joined by China and Pakistan. Pakistan is also a part of SCO. So that's where that Indian, those Indian attempts to have a strategic autonomy and to be neutral are challenging for India. And this is where maybe they will have to make certain changes. But to be sure, they will have to make certain changes because of their attitude towards China, not their attitude towards Russia. So even if they will say, next year we are not training if you bring in the Chinese, uh, even if this happens, Indians will still be willing to hold bilateral exercises with Russia. About this, I am sure.
Wow, that's very extensive and very interesting. I might add that actually they also balance the whole situation, having and holding, combat exercises with American special forces in the
Yeah,
Himalayas, which just happened recently. So
yeah,
actually, they put their eggs in many baskets, which seems kind of a smart and intelligent idea. And most of all, it's kind of neutral because they work with everyone. They present their interests, which is a beautiful bridge to Mr. Jaishankar, who is a really interesting gentleman. He is well educated. He was the Indian ambassador to China, to the US. He comes from a prominent family. And yes, he's highly intelligent and very outspoken. And he defends Indians' policies in various meetings, like recently the famous one in Bratislava. and also many others. He stated, for example, during a recent, I think, Chinese visit in India, that the state of the border will determine the state of the relationship. And then
Hmm.
he spoke at many times about, recently, for example, about buying resources from Russia. And then he said, yeah, we are buying gasoline, but you're buying gas. And so what's the difference? So could you please talk about a little bit about this really interesting person?
Yes, before I do, to kind of, let's say, create a bridge between what I was speaking about moments ago about that India's strategic autonomy and neutrality, and the person and position of their foreign minister. Well, uh, yes, I do believe it's smart on New Delhi's side to try to be neutral, but. I may be a bit less, less praising about this as you, in the sense that let's remember that each such choice creates opportunities as well as challenges. For one thing is what we already discussed, that those military exercises where even in India, a brow may be raised. Why are we holding exercises with China? And there is a each such choice, because to be neutral you have to be ambiguous, and ambiguity is sometimes good and sometimes bad, and I think some of those Indian choices are actually not that good politically for them. For example, that ambiguity about the Quad. Indians, they do not want to be seen as the allies of the US, so they keep saying Quad is not an alliance. Okay, well, I get it. I understand this, but um, that's not only a signal sent internally. That's not only a signal sent to the US and not only a signal sent to Russia. It's also a signal sent to China. And maybe it's a weak signal. Remember, because China says, "Oh, okay, so that's not an alliance." Well, that's great, because that means that there are no, because NATO has security guarantees. If you attack one NATO member, all NATO members
Yes.
will help. No, that doesn't work for Quad, right? So the Chinese may say, "Oh, right, so actually, if Quad is not an alliance, that's better for us. I mean, we can take on India, and others are not bound legally to help, right?" So let's just remember that while I think basically Indian neutrality and strategic autonomy has worked so far, even this year, 2022, for India's benefit, it also created a lot of political ambiguities, which India finds, challenges. For example, when Modi tried to talk to Xi Jinping, it was like half-hearted. It seems now, because they held summits, but India claimed these were informal summits. I mean, how can the heads of two states meet and say that it's an informal meeting? How can a meeting between two heads of states be informal? So
I
again,
would like to jump in and say that Minister of Foreign Affairs, he was also recently challenged with the term that Quad might be an Asian NATO, and he explained, no, it's not. And then he replied, he also said, yeah, you have to see it from the Asian way, because you have a Western perception, but it's not what you're saying. So he really he tries to
yeah,
explain it in many different ways. By the way, I will put all on this in the description, the relevant links. Okay, please continue.
yeah. But I'll talk about him in a moment. I just wanted to stress that. Uh, India has also created a lot of political ambiguities on an international arena, which are also working to New Delhi's disadvantage. For example, if you have an informal summit with China, what does it actually mean, an informal summit? Do you really want a resolution of the territorial dispute with China, or are you just meeting with them? And if you're just meeting because it's an informal, then why are you meeting at all, right? So these are externally as well as internally debated measures. Now, yes, the foreign minister is a part of this for good as well as bad reasons. Mr. Jaishankar is indeed a very seasoned diplomat. He actually is a case of a career diplomat who became a politician, right? I mean, and
Yes.
he has huge experience indeed. He was a diplomat in Europe, and very crucially for what we are discussing here now, he has been. Yeah, I'm sorry. He used to be India's ambassador, I think, to China. Uh,
Right
so
after this in the US.
yeah, yeah. So like two most important
Yes, exactly.
directions for Indian foreign
So both
policy.
sides know him, and he also knows the major figures in both countries, which is quite
Yeah,
interesting.
by the way, Mr. Jaishankar, having served in both two countries, has served in two countries which are also India's top economic partners when it comes to trade. China and US are. So that's not only a security and political relationship; it's also an
But not
economic
in Russia,
relationship.
right? Another
Sorry.
major, but not in Russia, right? Another major
Yeah, well,
site.
as a total trade partner, Russia is like many times less important for India than the US and China. It's like no comparison. They sell India weapons, yes, but overall, like last year, I think Russia's total trade volume with India was like 17 times smaller than China's trade volume with India, or something around this. So there's
What
no
I
comparison.
meant,
But
because we
sorry,
discussed China and America, I say he was not posted in Russia. That would be like, then he would know everyone. So it's
yeah,
only in China and the US.
yeah. So to finally answer your question about Minister Jaishankar, well, I think they chose the right person because he's very versatile. That's something very typical of Indian elites. He speaks English very well, So and
Yes,
he not only knows the people, he knows how to talk to the West, which is, for
yes.
example,
He
something
knows
I
the Western
believe.
concepts. Yes.
Sorry.
He knows the Western concepts, how we see the world. Yes,
Yes, and I think in situations like 2022, when India was heavily criticized for their no non-criticism of Russia, uh, Mr. Jaishankar was the right person to have to a suave, outspoken diplomat who knew how to counter the West. Now, to be sure, not everything he said were things I liked, because indeed, let's remember, India did use the opportunity of Russia's growing isolation to buy Russian oil. Now, to put it in perspective, Russia was nearly insignificant as a source of oil to
yes,
India until this year. Like last year, 2021, around 1 to 2% of Indian oil imports were coming from Russia. So a very small amount. Now Russia has only become a major. That's only short term for now. Russia has only become a major supplier of oil to India within the last months. It seems that the main reason simply is that Russia is growingly isolated. Their economy, despite their claiming otherwise, is in tatters, in terrible shape. So
exactly.
it seems that the Russians are so desperate that they have offered India oil at a highly reduced price. Now let us remember, there is no oil pipeline connecting Russia and India. So it's a 23-day long ship journey to transport oil from Russia to India. I believe it's only affordable because of the reduced price. Otherwise, India is, traditionally, so to speak, importing from Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Iraq. These are much closer. And
Yeah,
so, the transportation should be cheaper. So now India took that opportunity and began to import much more oil barrels. And indeed, as you said, for this, India has been again heavily criticized by the West. And indeed, Mr. Jaishankar has weathered that storm well by saying, by using the traditional "what about" point, by saying, uh, well, but what we purchased from Russia is what Europe purchases from Russia in one afternoon. I believe he was right, because at the beginning India has only contracted 1 million oil barrels from Russia, while the estimates before the war started were that Europe, Europe as such was until the war Russia's largest customer for oil, when Europe was buying something like 3 to 4 million oil barrels per day. So
Hmm.
indeed, he was right at that point. Let's just remember that that was, I think, in March. And since then, we don't know the exact numbers, but the media claim that India has been purchasing 700 to 800,000 barrels per day. So that's no longer just 1 million per one contract, right? So India has purchased much more. And that's one thing. And the other thing is that we don't know how the Russian oil exports to Europe will end up, right? I mean, so with each passing day, the situation is so dynamic that Minister Jaishankar was less and less right about this, possibly with each passing day and month. Um, but yes, I think he used a fair point. I think it was fair to point out that the West cannot criticize India for purchasing oil as long as the West keeps purchasing Russian coal, oil, gas, and many other commodities. Let us remember that maybe the West will stop buying it from
Yes,
Russia, and then the West will be
yes,
in a more comfortable position to
yes,
criticize Russia. Uh, but yes,
yes.
India
I
had the
think
right, of course, criticize India. Obviously, sorry for the mistake. So I think it was a fair and a good, diplomatic tactic on the side of Minister Jaishankar, and what you mentioned about how he addresses China. I like. Well, my liking or disliking it has nothing to do with this. What I meant is that I think he has a good approach towards China, with him being bold enough towards China. This is how, given their tense relation with China, how he should react, in my opinion. However, there are certain ways in which he's explaining India's position on Russia, which I clearly, I must say, this disliked. Uh, Later, he used another point when he said that I'm an external minister of a country with a poor population, so I, cannot afford, politics in a way. If there is cheaper oil, I must buy. Well, I don't like this phrasing because it's kind of,
I
like
can quote him. He
yeah.
literally said, "We don't send people to go buy Russian oil. We send people to buy the best oil in the market." That's what he said.
Yeah, but he also said something about, India having a lot of poor citizens, and because of this, he claimed that, India, must buy cheaper oil. That it is the kind of like the moral obligation of the Indian government. I don't like this framing because, let's be honest, they are just taking a good deal only because Russia is desperate. It's a transactional approach that has nothing to do with ethics. Everyone wants to buy cheaper, and we should not, morally hijack this issue by saying that, a government is responsible towards its poor citizens. Well, each government is, right. I mean, we could say the same thing about Europe. Does the fact that mm, that buying from Russia uh, leads to certain services and Europe being cheaper, would this justify European governments who want to continue importing those resources? Right? I don't believe it justifies. I mean, we either see Russia as a foe, and then we need to do something to at least reduce our imports from Russia, so that our money does not fund their military, right? But of course, Indian perspective is different, because at the end of the day, what matters is that for India, Russia is not a threat.
Okay, last topic would be, or subtopic. Please tell me, how popular is he in India, or maybe how is he perceived in the country? Is he a
You mean
divisive
Minister
figure? a popular figure in India. Yes, in his country. Yes.
Minister Jaishankar.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes. Well, I think among the ministers, he's one of those with a better image. I think he's basically very good at handling his image. However, I don't see him as as politically strong person. Let us remember, he's a career diplomat, which means he never had to build a constituency of his own. He
Okay.
was a foreign secretary, so like the highest bureaucrat in the Ministry of External Affairs, before being nominated by Prime Minister Modi into becoming the External Affairs Minister. At which point he joined the ruling party BJP, of which he was never Modi's party, of which he was never a member before. He never had to, take part in. He never had to fight elections. It doesn't represent any constituency, right?
Yes.
So that's not a person which I would see as, for example, a future prime minister of India. For that, you have to have a constituent, you have to have a strong position in the party and win elections. I think when this party stops ruling, Minister Jaishankar ceases to be a minister, and I don't think he will become a politician, and I don't think he can, win elections and become an important party member. But I may be wrong about this. So his
Also,
position, yes, his position is based on how well he's handling Indian foreign policy, but that's all about this.
one more aspect that is important for me and interesting is how is he in comparison with Chinese officials? Like he's a good-looking guy. He's well-educated. He's westernized. I mean, and he knows the
Yeah.
West. He speaks English well. So actually, and he never threatens. He never pushes anyone. So he's kind of almost the opposite of his Chinese counterparts. He's really, really a likable person, and you can admire his intellect or not, agree with him or not. But there is almost nothing like that you could say about Chinese officials or ministers of foreign affairs, or maybe like the Minister of Defense who is threatening the whole world in Shangri-La. So this is a different approach that I think is more acceptable and likable.
Certainly, Minister Jaishankar is a part of that. There is a larger whole that basically, as I mentioned before, I think the fact that Indian elites, including political elites, are largely, so westernized and, partially even West educated, speaking English well, makes them, mm, more careful and more understanding, more considerate in dealings with the West. They know how to talk to the West. Whereas while I'm not a specialist, sorry, on China, that entire wolf warrior diplomacy, I think it's something where China is making a mistake, and that's a mistake India is not making. They don't have comparable policy to the wolf warrior diplomacy. So indeed, it works. Let's just remember, and yes, indeed, India has been on the international level very successful in building an image of a benign power. No, but
Yes.
let's just remember that the picture is not so rosy when it comes to what Indians actually do in their neighborhood. I, for example, mentioned earlier during our conversation that India has its own military officers controlling certain aspects of Mauritius forces. Now that's bold, right? That's not really being benign if your agreement, I mean, someone had to create some pressure or use some leverage to achieve this. It's not normal for a coast guard of a sovereign country to be led by an officer of another country. This is, kind of actions, a type of action for which the Americans are traditionally known. Maybe not this specific type, but this kind of bold pressurizing approach. So let's just remember, Indians do this too, only that they do it in their neighborhood. I could give you so many other examples, like the Indian government blocking from time to time transit into Nepal to force certain decisions to be taken in Nepal. So it's not that I like everything about Indian foreign policy. There are things I clearly dislike, and especially in their neighborhood, they sometimes are very, pressurizing towards weaker partners or neighbors. But yes, on the rhetorical level and diplomatic level, New Delhi has been successful in creating an image of a benign power where such aspects like who knows that the Mauritius Coast Guard is led by an Indian officer, like it's kind of off the radar for some reason, and everybody knows that India is a benign power, and nobody knows this fact about the Mauritius Coast Guard. So they have been successful while the Chinese failed. I think the Chinese are kind of that elephant in a room full of porcelain, right? They feel so bold, and they seem to be completely believing that their claims are right, that they have no idea. That maybe was too strongly put. They seem to not understand that the other side has a completely different perspective. Whereas when I look at Indian diplomats, they at least understand that the West has a different perspective. They still want to focus on their own national interests, but they know that being too aggressive towards the West would be counterproductive. And that's something that China simply does not understand, I think. I mean, by China, I mean Chinese diplomats and the Chinese government.
Krzysiek, Christopher, Chris, thank you very much. It was really an amazing discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for watching the video. If you want more, like it. Please let me know in the comments who should I talk to next time. And if you didn't like it, share it.